Star Wars The Acolyte has seen probably the largest backlash for any Star Wars anything I've ever seen in my entire life in regards to Star Wars media, even Star Wars products in general. A coherent theme exists amongst the online communities, specifically on YouTube, that this new show has killed Star Wars, or it's killing Star Wars, or it's the end of it. The issue I take with this perspective is not that it's wrong. It's a fine perspective to have, especially if you're a heavily invested Star Wars fan. I prefer to see it as Star Wars has changed. This show has changed Star Wars to a degree that many, many fans will feel threatened or upset by the change, because no longer does Star Wars fit into a nice, neat little box that it used to exist in. Now we see that Star Wars is as agenda and politically driven as any other media can be in this time, where it's more important to establish who you are. We'll get to the who those are in a little bit, than it is to establish a cohesive story beyond something. I hate to use the term juvenile, but beyond something, dare I say, formulaic. We see a lot of reoccurring themes in Star Wars. We see a lot of tropes and science fiction stereotypes, for lack of better terms, that work well in that genre because it allows for, some use of the imagination by the audience in order to fill in the gaps, right? When you have a limited time frame and you have a large universe you've created, you can't answer every problem. You shouldn't answer every problem. What you should aim to do, though, is pique the interest of the audience enough so that they want to come back to see what else might happen. It should not be the point of, and I should clarify, fantasy science fiction, right? Fantastical science fiction, which is what Star Wars has always been. It's not what some people call, quote unquote, hard sci-fi, where it's driven forward by, intense focus on the science, even if it's made up, aspect of the science fiction. It's more on the fiction side. It's more of the, look at how much fun this stuff is. And that's what makes, sci-fi like Star Wars very enjoyable to lots of people, is that it's cockamamie, to say the least. It's crazy. I've never seen anything like this in my entire life, is what many people would often say in regards to witnessing Star Wars for the first time. What the Acolyte does, and many modern Star Wars properties do, is they take this aspect of what is formulaic and they inject into it what our existence now in a world that is driven by social media and instant gratification and the ability to share anything anonymously without any repercussions to what we have to say, or without even having to have a discourse, is you get this polarized perspective. Now, mind you, I'm not saying a polarized story. I'm just saying the perspective of the show. Right? I'm not going to plant my feet and say that Star Wars Acolyte is wrong. I'm not going to say that it has killed Star Wars. But it has taken it a direction more so than even Kenobi did, more so than even the Book of Boba Fett, which was highly agenda-driven. It's taken it a direction that it's going to see more discourse on that than on the meat and potatoes of what makes the show tick. That's inherently problematic in anything we do as humans. When we look at a subject matter, it can be anything. It doesn't have to be media. let's take, you know, our, our jobs, any job that we have, and we politicize any aspect of it or agenda drive any aspect of it, either at the leadership or at the, the base level, the foundation level, the base employee level, or anywhere in between. It's going to create strife and it's going to create animosity because there's going to be disagreement. Add to that a world now where there are less people prepared to engage in discourse because they don't actively have to engage in discourse because the algorithms of social media have put forth in front of them a lack of discourse. It's just feeding them what they want to hear because it derives the return click, the subscribe, the like click, and it drives a response in those individuals that makes them feel good. I fall prey to this. We all do. It's, as we're learning, it's a critical flaw in human nature now that we weren't prepared for, is that the siloing effect, as some would call it, is very strong. And it drives us to tribalize our aspects of culture even more so than what we knew was possible before the advent of internet technologies. So here we have a show which is heavily driven on an agenda towards an LGBTQIA plus narrative, which is not a bad thing. That is inherently not a bad thing. It's a great thing to have that in media. More exposure to minority perspectives, the diversification of perspectives is going to broaden people's understandings of what is socially tolerable. This is the only way as a species we grow to become more tolerant of each other, is by having some exposure to it. Where it becomes an issue is that if it is not inherently an enjoyable process, if it is media-wise, if it is not something that the viewer wants to watch more and more and more, it's going to create a splitting effect, the inverse of a diversity building effect. It's going to create a divide where audiences, and not just a single divide, but multiple divides, where different members of the audience are going to find different things that stand out more than the story does. So to draw a little bit from anecdote, from personal story, growing up a diehard Star Wars fan, watching the movies over and over as a kid, I recall enjoying with my friends out in the playground, boy and girl, gay and straight, black and white, and every phenotype we choose to dictate what is important about people, which is not how it should work. We enjoyed discoursing on what was unknown, right? So back when I was a kid, late 80s, early 90s, we didn't know everything about Boba Fett. We didn't know if he survived the Sarlacc pit. We didn't know all these different things about his background. And eventually books came out, which solved a lot of those mysteries and answered a lot of those puzzles. But until you read those books, which most of my friends didn't, and I wouldn't bother them with it allowed people to experiment using imagination to create narratives for these characters and to discourse about why they were so great. I recall having an incredibly advanced argument or discourse with my friends about which Star Wars characters are actually the most powerful, based upon this whole idea that, well, if you look at characters like Wedge Antilles and Han Solo, who are arguably non-force wielding characters. So the force is in everything. That's not their main thing, right? It's not the most powerful part about them. You see that they play pivotal key roles in the Star Wars franchise films, because that's all there was at that time, the original trilogy. Right? You see these characters, Chewbacca, play important aspects that call into question, for me at least, whether or not the Force is the end-all be-all. Now that discourse builds a love for the universe of the Star Wars, because you're not arguing about real-life, agenda-driven political narratives. You're discoursing about make-believe stuff that involve make-believe characters and make-believe universe, and that's how powerful it is. And for some people, this universe became very, very important. I know as a child, Star Wars helped me derive decision makings, it helped me decide upon how I would act, because it embedded in me some sense of what kind of person I wanted to be. I didn't want to be a Jedi. I didn't want to be a Sith, and I didn't want to be a scoundrel. I wanted to be the go-to reliable friend that we see in somebody like Chewbacca, or you see in somebody like Wedge Antilles, that you see in characters that aren't the main characters, that aren't driven by some need to defeat evil because it's their destiny, but because it's the right thing to do. That's the power something like this has. Now, if you inject a political agenda into that exists in the real world, you are going to take the diversities that occur, you're going to take the discourses that go alongside with those diversities that are not necessarily negative or positive, and you're going to force the audience to make a stand because they may or may not agree with the agenda or the perspective that exists now in their universe that they used possibly to escape from such discourses. And when you don't do the agenda justice by having some sort of identifiable discourse in the media, then you disservice and you dumben the audience by saying, hey, this is the right one. This is how it should be because I said so. Because we're showing you. Or in the case of Star Wars The Acolyte, we're telling you. Well, that's the main issue I see with The Acolyte right now. Now, add to that the story is garbage. It is absolutely garbage. There are things there that would absolutely work and would work phenomenally if it had the narrative backbone that allowed it to engage the audience in such a way that their imagination, their interest was piqued as well. But instead, every little gap is filled. Every little notion of what if is answered for, or what is put on display is so poorly done that you don't want to be interested in it. You don't want to be engaged in it. You don't want your imagination to run away with it. Instead, you're left going, well, that's just dumb. So there's been a lot of talk about the twin narrative, the birth from two female characters, without there being a male involved. That's absolutely fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But there's an argument between the two mother characters. Oh, I carried, and then the other said, I created. We don't need to know that as the audience. It goes into too much superfluous detail. I understand you're trying to make a point. The show leaders are the show backers are trying to make a point here. But that's not what makes it interesting. What would make it interesting, in my perspective, they could do something like, I carried them, and we don't know where they came from. Maybe it coincides with some mystical celebration we had, or some ritual we had, and oh my gosh, you were pregnant with twins, and they seem extremely powerful. This thing we call the thread. That's fine if you want to call it the thread. There's nothing wrong with renaming the Force. That's absolutely fine. I mean, there's thousands of religions on Earth right now that are very similar to one another in the fact that they're monotheistic, but they all have different lexicons, vernaculars. That's fine. That's intriguing. That's exciting. What isn't exciting is when you tell the audience. You don't show us. You don't give us an involvement. Instead, you're telling us, I had this role in it. Okay, well, I guess how? Do I want to know how? Do I want you to go into more detail into that? I mean, me personally, not really. Maybe some people do. But it gets back to the point that where these people are coming from that are saying that Star Wars is dead or this show has killed Star Wars is that point inherently. The story isn't giving them a reason to ask why. Now it's an agenda driven by a showrunner who has put forth that with comments like, she doesn't care if we don't like Star Wars. What matters is what she wants to put into it is being said. No one person should have that much power in anything they do. And I understand that that is very much counter to reality in the United States. We live in and work in these microcosms of society that are oftentimes dictated by one individual and one individual's vision and goal. That's not healthy. That's not good. We've learned that there needs to be a diversity of discourses in everything we do in order to survive the long term. And I surely hope, now we're only 3 episodes into Acolyte so far, but I surely hope that by the time we get to episodes 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8, that this has all been a ruse to rile up the audience to show, hey, but it's still Star Wars. I don't see that happening. I see this show as being too headstrong in its own approach to see past that. With the death of these Jedi Master, who I can't remember the name of the character, which is a bad sign, Mara or something like that, that's played by the actress who played Trinity. Awesome. She's deflecting, or not deflecting, but force holding a throwing weapon to save a barkeep, and what we don't know at the time, and potentially their child too. But is in turn hit by one in the chest. Now, this is done in such a manner that it seems like it's instantaneously happened, but the character just extends one arm. May just extends one arm to seemingly throw 2 darts in 2 different directions at once, which I guess is possible with the Force, but I don't see a Master Jedi being distracted by that one dart so much that they miss the dart that's coming at them. And this brings up another argument that has really waylaid the show, is that a lot of people say, well, how come she dies from this when we clearly see in so many other Star Wars things where a lightsaber blade doesn't kill all these other characters? In fact, 2 other female characters that don't die of lightsaber strikes through the abdomen when Qui-Gon does. And that's a fair argument to make. It's changing the expected reality in a universe to fit a poorly designed narrative. And that's where I'm driving at. There needs to be more time spent in the story creation time. And mind you, I don't know anything about making a show. I'm not going to argue that, but I know how to make a story. Right? I know how to concoct and develop a good story. Just because you can doesn't mean you should. There needs to be somebody at these Star Wars shows in the process that's being made going, time out. This counters these other things that have been done. The Holdo maneuver, for example. Why? Why are we doing this? I know we can, and to some people it might be thrilling and fascinating, but to the vast majority of Star Wars audience that's deeply invested in this universe, that's not going to go down well. Maybe not have them stabbed by the lightsaber, but gravely wounded by it. The character in Book of Boba Fett that gets stabbed in the abdomen, you didn't have to have her stabbed in the abdomen. She could have had an arm chopped off. She gets an entirely robotic arm. She could have had any other limb chopped off in this case. Could have been a really bad gash. We saw Finn come back from, his spine being scraped by a lightsaber, for goodness sakes. We know the technology exists and back to exist that heals people from grievous wounds, but I don't know about, a strike through the abdomen or through the core, like we see in Kenobi. And here, it shows, I don't want to say laziness. There's nothing lazy about making a show, right? It takes a great deal of work and a whole bunch of people, a whole bunch of money. It's not lazy, but it shows a cavalier, it's almost an echo of what the show is trying to put forth in general, that the hubris of the Jedi was their downfall. Well, the hubris of the showrunners and the designers and of this is its downfall for many Star Wars fans, because you're not doing the existing canon, the existing universe, any credit. You're just defying it for the sake of it to drive an agenda that isn't being driven for the sake of promoting the Star Wars universe or benefiting it. You're just wanting to benefit your agenda. And I understand that that's really important when you're a minority. I can't familiarize with a lot of minorities. I'm a single white male, privileged white male, as many people would say. But as a trained and studied anthropologist, what I can say is that in order for me to get the emic or the insider's perspective to your plight so that I can learn from and understand it is not done through this manner. It's done by opening a dialogue and a discourse that might be painful, but is in turn learnable and enjoyable. And if there's any questions on how to do that, look at like debates, which we see with like Intelligence Squared or any of these other medias that present a diversity of discourse from, divergent and non-agreeable sides that's very enjoyable, not just for the audience, but for the people participating in it, done in a sometimes formal, but a very cordial setting. And I can say from my perspective that the reason this is getting so much backlash because this is not being handled in a cordial way. It's being handled in a accept it or don't watch it. And that's just not healthy. That's just not the way to have these discourses, to have these interactions with individuals who might already not agree with you. Right? You can be subtle, and that subtlety can slowly work it into the zeitgeist. That's painful for the people who are in the plight of the minority. It's painful and it takes time. But that's one avenue that might actually spell more rewards of the long term. Because any cause that is worth fighting for, you have to be able to fight for in the long term. You can't just demand instant results, which this show appears to be trying to do. And, it makes me trepidatious about my approach to future Star Wars properties. Because, you made me wonder with one show, Book of Boba Fett, can they make a show that challenges the idea of a social justice warrior Boba Fett transition from the most ruthless bounty hunter in the galaxy to wanting to protect the few and the downtrodden in Tatooine, to make him stand out as a social justice warrior? I'm all for it. There's nothing wrong with that. And anybody who says that that inherently ruins the universe, I mean, no, not really. It's just challenging it. And we all need to be challenged from time to time. But perhaps not the way to do it. To Kenobi, which is, presenting that a female retribution story can be as powerful as any other story. Absolutely. A revenge story from somebody who was hurt as a child and wants to break the system from the inside. That's powerful. That's extremely powerful. That is calling towards the civil rights movement. That's calling forth all of these aspects of human nature that have been very, very decisive for how our culture has gone, especially here in the United States, has gone forth to try to do better. But as we're seeing kickbacks now in our culture, in our society, to, what advances we have made, it might be because the media that is attempting to use these narratives is not doing it in a way that'll engage audiences in a non-controversial manner. It's one thing to allow the audience to derive from it, well, maybe this is what they're trying to say, and my perspective might not align with that. But you know what? That's just my imaginations of it, to just throwing it in front of the audience, saying, this is how it's going to be. And you got to like it. You got to take it how it is, and you got to like it, or else you don't really like it and you're not really a Star Wars fan. That's not really doing your best. That's not putting your best foot forward to enwrap an audience into your perspective That's being an authoritarian. That's saying that's being so far to the opposite direction of what you're fighting to begin with that you're kind of echoing some of that behavior to make your point. And it's not going to work. You're just going to get a backlash from people who don't agree with you. The trick really is to find a middle ground. And if you want a great example of that, watch Star Wars Rebels. Watch Star Wars The Clone Wars. I mean, I know a lot of people won't watch them because they're animated, but they do a phenomenal job of being true to the Star Wars universe, the canon, and telling complex alternative perspectives without being agenda driven. Andor does a phenomenal job of portraying the plight of the little person in a universe where everything is more powerful than you are. And going to prison for something that you probably shouldn't go to prison for. You know, and becoming a stereotype that many people would see as negative and doing the best you can to still come out of it a good person, to still do the right thing. That's a powerful narrative. It's not agenda driven. There's nothing from our current political systems or current political dialogues that is inherently driving that narrative. Are there parallels? Yes, but they're parallel. There's no overlap. There's no crossing. There's no touching. They do it in such a way that audiences from any political background can watch it and go, wow, I really like that. And if you watch a lot of the contrast comparisons between Andor and the Acolyte, you see that the audience members that don't like Acolyte, that point out the things they don't like about the Acolyte, are kind of still there in Andor, but they're driven in such a way that it's not going to make, you know, a fundamentalist for any side take up arms. And so it can be said that, from my perspective, if Star Wars The Acolyte is attempting to be an LGBTQIA plus agenda more than a good Star Wars story, it has failed to do so because it has created more animosity. It has created more division than it has created allies. And any minority group needs allies. It needs white males like me to watch it and go, yeah, that's right. That girl boss kicked ass, and she's a lesbian, and she's born from two mothers, and she's a minority, and she had everything against her, or they, and I love it. And I love it. I love that they're strong with the Force, and they do their own thing, and there's no power in the verse that's going to stop them. But instead, you have many, many white males going, this is bad. And, you know, you have white males like a white male like me watching the show going, this is just bad storytelling. That's why I don't want to watch it, because it's bad storytelling. It's not lazy. Like I said, there's nothing inherently lazy about making a show. It's just not good. There's too many aspects of it that don't make sense. Why is there a prisoner on a droid controlled ship that can hack droids other than plot convenience? Why is the Force wielding character even on that ship? Why are the Jedi arresting people and putting them in with like other prisoners? I mean, this would clearly be a highly dangerous person to put on a ship with other prisoners. You know, it's hard to talk about because these could be good narratives. They could be really good stories, but they're not set up or done in such a way that, you know, and that makes me want to watch it. It's not done in a good way. It's not done in a way that drives the Star Wars narrative. You know, and it's hard not to look at all the minutia as well. You know, she crash lands on an ice planet and you can't see her breath. she's standing on a ledge, and they tell her not to fall off the ledge, to watch her step, and she falls off the ledge still. It's just trying too hard to be something it can't be because the story isn't there. Do I have ideas as to how the story could be done better? Yeah. Do I have ideas on how the sequel trilogies could have made much more sense and been a better story? Absolutely. But though I'm a privileged white male, I don't have the means of making any of that stand out. I don't have the means of making that, meaningfully realistic. And that's reality. But it doesn't stop me from using my imagination to, make Star Wars enjoyable. And that's the crux of my argument. Star Wars didn't used to be about making the story enjoyable via your imagination. The story was good. It wasn't great. It wasn't fantastic. It was good. And it engaged people like me and lots of people all over the world to engage our imagination about little aspects of it we didn't know, to fill in those gaps, to create a world, a universe that we fit into. And that's where the minority groups fit into it really, really well. And they could and should run with that to push to become maybe they can't be a minority in numbers, but they can equal the power threshold. Because if the Force really is like a river, and we choose whether or not we are the stick floating along with it and enjoying what time we have in the free-flowing river before we become lodged in the bank or destroyed by its power, or we choose to be the rock, ungiving and unbending, slowly eroding away, slowly weathering to the almighty power of water. As anybody who knows anything about geology knows that a river isn't about moving water. It's the transportation of sediment. And that rock will be reverted to sediment in time, and it will be transported. And what power it thought it had will be stripped away to nothing. So the real trick, as the Force tells us, is to be one with the river, if that's what the Force is. And the Acolyte right now is being the rock. It's ungiving, it's unbending, and it's not really approachable. And that's why we're getting so much negative feedback to it. And I know nobody will ever listen to this that has any power to change things in the Star Wars community. But I'll tell you, if you hired anthropologists who are masters of culture to have some sort of leeway or some sort of a voice in the room to say, hey, this may or may not work because of this. And this is the tools that anthropologists have to make maybe some changes that won't be so, problematic. It might be different. And I don't know if there are anthropologists involved in the making of something like Star Wars The Acolyte. Boy, howdy, are they missing the basic tenements of the field. The quote-unquote prime directive that we do or do not have. Star Wars The Acolyte can still be an amazing show. And to many people, probably is an amazing show. There's nothing wrong with that. But if you feel so threatened, if you love Star Wars Acolyte, or if you created it and you feel so threatened or challenged by the audience that has taken to it so negatively, my final thoughts on it are, then do what you want all of them to do and listen. Actively listen and learn so that as it goes forth, or as Star Wars in general goes forward, it can do better. Because right now it's doing okay. But okay is not good enough for something as big as Star Wars.